Good evening, everyone, and welcome. We'll give folks a few more moments to join. Thank you for being here tonight. Hey, again, good evening and welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us tonight. My name is Leila Atala. I live here in Santa Fe and work on existing building electrification, building decarbonization in the Western US. My background is in environmental science and economics, and I'm going to be your host and moderator tonight. We are here tonight to learn about why so many New Mexicans are against Iberdrola and Avangrid's proposed buyout of PNM, which would impact more than 500,000 ratepayers and dramatically shift New Mexico's energy future. Avangrid is a subsidiary of Iberdrola, a giant international energy conglomerate with deep ties to Qatar and BlackRock and an abysmal worldwide record. As most folks know, the PRC rejected the proposed merger last year because it found that it would not be in the public interest. But Avangrid has continued to push itself on New Mexico, and we see its political influence as they partnered with the new governor-appointed PRC to ask the Supreme Court to allow them to withdraw their appeal and send the merger proposal back to the new PRC for reconsideration. In light of this, we wanted to host a panel with folks who have direct experience with Avangrid's practices and the mountain of evidence of their poor service record. We believe that it's critical that New Mexicans have this information. Before we get into the conversation, a couple technical reminders. We're recording tonight, and this recording will be available. We're going to have folks use the Q&A function, please, to submit questions for the panel. And we'll start out with some pre-prepared questions for them and then move to your questions afterwards. And please don't submit your questions in the chat. Just go ahead and use the Q&A for that. Before the conversation, I want to start with land acknowledgement. Those of us in New Mexico live in the ancestral homelands of the Pueblo, Diné, Apache, Comanche, Ute, and Kiowa peoples. And any work for energy justice must be work with Indigenous communities to stop the systematic theft and destruction of sacred lands and the disproportionate energy burden and pollution exposure faced by many Indigenous communities. Now, without further ado, let's meet our panel of community activists and experts from New Mexico and other states who have first-hand experience of Avangrid's utility practices. Tonight, we're joined by former Public Regulation Commissioner and current New Mexico State Auditor, Joe Maestas. In 2021, Joe voted with his colleagues on the PRC to unanimously reject the PNM Avangrid merger. Representing District 3, Northern New Mexico, Joe took the lead on successfully establishing rules to implement community solar and make solar accessible, affordable, and reliable, and led the charge to expand broadband services. Next, we have Our Power co-founder, Seth Berry. Seth is a Maine-based business, education, and policy leader and has served 7 terms as a Maine state representative, including as House Majority Leader and chair of the Committee on Energy, Utilities, and Technology. Leading the charge for a replacement of Avangrid-owned utility Central Maine Power, he co-founded Our Power to fight for a consumer-owned utility that will focus on the state's climate goals, cutting costs, and improving reliability. Next, Dr. Michelle Wunderlich is an organizer and policy specialist for Metro Justice New York, where Avangrid-owned utility RG&E is facing calls for municipalization after egregious billing and customer service errors that have outraged the public. The New York State Department of Public Service is investigating both RG&E and Avangrid's other New York subsidiary, NYSEG, for billing problems after receiving thousands of complaints. Michelle has been active in movements for energy democracy and climate justice since 2008. Lastly, we have Marielle Nanasi, an Executive Director of New Energy Economy. New Energy Economy spearheaded the successful case for rejection of the PNM Avangrid merger in New Mexico in 2021, and has been a leading voice and legal advocate for the establishment of community-owned power and 100% renewable energy in New Mexico since 2008. Thank you all for taking the time to share your expertise and experience with us tonight. Let's kick off the discussion. As you have questions, please go ahead and put them in the Q&A and we'll get to them. We will almost certainly not get to every question, so please know that we're going to be collecting them in a Google document and making sure to answer them and send that around to event attendees afterwards. Please do share your questions and we'll do our best to answer them. We're so excited that you're here for this conversation. But first, we prepared some questions to get things going, and we're going to start with Joe. Why is Iberdrola/Avangrid's buyout of PNM concerning to you?
Thank you, Layla, for that. And I just want to clarify for everyone that, my position and my participation has nothing to do with my capacity as New Mexico State Auditor. And I've been asked to basically revisit my decision as one of 5 commissioners that unanimously denied the merger. And I want to just make it clear to everyone that the subject of the merger case was a stipulated agreement that entailed a number of concessions around a major financial transaction, which primarily was a stock buyout. Now, let me preface, my role as a commissioner at that time, and that is we are statutorily required to try and balance the interests of stockholders and ratepayers in everything that we do. But in the case of this merger, we have to test this merger as being in the public interest. So we were subject to a public interest standard. And the way we operate in the Public Regulation Commission at that time, and that's still the case today, is that we delegate advisory authority to administrative law judges. And so in the case of the merger, we had our senior and most experienced administrative law judge preside over the case and handles all the procedural issues. And at the end of the case, when all parties have testified, the ALJ, the administrative law judge, in this case, renders what's called a recommended decision. And by law, we can either accept the decision in whole or in part, or reject it outright. And so I just want to kind of set the stage for the procedure in terms of how we operate and how we're advised by these what we call hearing examiners or administrative law judges. And so based on my recollection, and again, I don't have too much time to really go into some of the specifics, but from my perspective, there were many parties that signed on to the stipulated agreement. We call them signatories, and they all had an interest in the transaction. But during the course of the case, the stipulated agreement underwent at least 3 major revisions. The concessions were constantly changing throughout the case. And I think the big game changer in terms of trying to balance ratepayer interest with shareholder interest was the Attorney General in this case basically signed on to support the first version of the stipulated agreement. And so it really kind of sent a chill throughout all the interveners in that, oh my goodness, the chief consumer advocate has basically signed on to the first version of the stipulated agreement. And as I mentioned before, it underwent at least 3 major revisions. And so I think that was part of the problem with this case, in that the negotiations and the stipulated agreement kept changing and changing and changing. Also, the PRC utility division, they're parties to the case, so we could not communicate with our own utility division. But as I recall, we hired a consultant who looked into a lot of the performance issues with many of the Avangrid subsidiaries in the East Coast. And their basic performance metric, and I'm generalizing, is that they're gauged on their ability to respond to natural disasters and restore power. And so what happened was this revelation was brought to the attention of the hearing examiner in the middle of the case. And I think the hearing examiner was very upset. He felt that the joint applicants, Avangrid PNM, were not being forthright in bringing all this information together. Other issues that arose, and we can talk about it later, but Avangrid Renewables already has a presence here in New Mexico, and they have a couple of wind farms. And in some of those cases, they really didn't comply with PRC filings, compliance filings, pre-approval, post-approval compliance filings. And I think the hearing examiner took that into consideration that, wow, I mean, if they're not forthcoming right now with their projects in New Mexico, then what does this present for enforcing, you know, all the concessions that made up the stipulated agreement? And I would say the last thing about the stipulated agreement is that right when the hearings closed and the recommended decision was being developed, negotiations were still going forward. And the hearing examiner, I think, was quite confused at that time. He was saying, I really don't know what we're dealing with, because things were changing so much. In fact, concessions were being made, as I recall, right up to the presentation of the recommended decision by the administrative law judge. And so that's the way it happens. He issues his recommended decision. We as a commission get to question the hearing examiner. And it turns out that his position was, it really didn't matter about any of the concessions around the transaction itself. He felt that the transaction was fundamentally flawed and that any concessions would not change his mind. And I parsed that out in my own questions. And when we were discussing the recommended decision among the entire commission, a lot of the commissioners, I think, were resigned to deny at that time. And I felt that the recommended decision could be a floor that could be a foundation for further negotiations for ratepayer benefits, but I can't negotiate with myself. And so we as a commission ended up unanimously denying the stipulated agreement. And so that's where we stand today. I apologize, I'm really summarizing this quite a bit, but that's just basically my recollection and my perspective that led to my vote to deny.
Thank you, Joe. Michelle and Seth, will go to a question for you now. One of the most consistent issues we're hearing about is billing problems with many Iberdrola and Avangrid subsidiaries. In Maine, they were fined $10 million for billing and service issues. In Scotland, they have charged customers and non-customers thousands in bills that they don't actually owe, and set aggressive debt collectors after customers. In New York, 2 subsidiaries are being investigated for billing issues, and calls for publicly owned power alternatives are rising in light of these consistent issues. Can you speak to your own experiences with this, Michelle and Seth?
Sure. Yeah. Thanks so much. Again, I am Michelle Wunderlich. I'm the organizer and policy specialist for Metro Justice's Rochester for Energy Democracy campaign, speaking from Haudenosaunee lands in upstate New York. And our campaign is a grassroots movement to replace RG&E, Rochester Gas and Electric, in the Rochester and Monroe County area with a community-owned and operated public utility. Metro Justice is a grassroots member-funded, member-driven organization that fights for economic, social, and racial justice that's been around since 1965. Just to give you, so RG&E was bought out by Avangrid here in 2008. They've been profiting off of failure for decades, but since being bought out, they seem to really be running the company into the ground. Despite, constant customer service failures, unnecessary prolonged power outages due to under maintenance, inaction on climate change, and ongoing billing errors, RG&E continues to charge devastatingly high rates and is filing for an additional 20% rate hike at the moment. So we believe that our community deserves a long-term tried and true solution to the RG&E crisis, which is a public utility. We'll talk about that more later. But basically, we think we have a real chance for a solution under New York state law. With an implementation study and a positive referendum, RG&E would be forced to sell. So some of our experience to directly talk about what we've seen RG&E be like here is more or less dangerously incompetent and predatory in times of crisis. So in terms of outages and reliability, to maximize profit for shareholders, Avangrid, like other investor-owned utility, forgoes maintenance and upgrades on power lines for decades, resulting in dangerous outages. So in 2017, RG&E left tens of thousands of residents stranded and without power in the heart of winter because of their negligence. In that year, in 2018, the following year, New York State fined them for poor power outage management. Furthermore, over the last Christmas holiday, their outage website went down right before a Christmas storm, leading to basically the county executive needing to call the CEO directly to have information that they needed to plan adequately. We've also received story after story of RG&E not repairing downed power lines for several days that are at risk, on falling on people's homes. In terms of COVID shutoffs, to give you an idea of kind of their company mentality, RG&E continued to illegally send shutoff notices throughout the COVID shutoff moratorium, trying to draw out money from people who couldn't afford to pay, and adding to the COVID eviction crisis. The largest issue, as you mentioned, is billing incompetence and basically sometimes billing customers thousands of dollars and insisting they're right until a customer spends weeks on the phone trying to navigate their non-existent customer service. So in fact, New York State Public Service Commission has started and then expanded a full-scale investigation into RG&E and NYSEG, that's also owned by Avangrid in New York State, about these widespread issues that continue without resolution. In terms of jobs, we also know that they have outsourced basically all of their call center and administrative jobs out of the area and transferred many line person and meter reader inspector jobs to contractor-based. So they're no longer union, no longer benefit jobs. We've heard about a huge amount of brain drain from the company as experienced people are fired or leave, and that management doesn't seem to prioritize, industry standards in engineering or do preventative maintenance. So on top of this, RG&E reported around $100 million in profits last year, which is up from 89 the year before. And this is particularly a huge and damaging issue in Rochester, because Rochester is one of the highest energy burdened places in the country. So 37% of homes in Rochester pay between 10 and 25% of their income just for energy utilities. And it's 44% for Black and Latino households. So it's a huge, huge burden, combined basically, there's a lot of poverty here, but also RG&E's crushingly high rates, and they want to increase rates by another 20%. Part of that rate increase, and we can talk about that more, is that we pay all of their cost plus a guaranteed rate of profit. And in the rate hike, they want to increase the rate of profit beyond what it already is. So they're incentivized to spend less and less on effective management while charging us more. I do have a number of direct stories from people, and I want to share at least a few of them. If we have more time, I can certainly share more. But for example, from Paul Zito. So we have also a website where these stories are shared, which I can make public to all of you. But Paul Zito says, my bill is up to $500 to $600 a month, and it used to be $100 to $125. I live alone in a 1,300 square foot apartment, and my energy use has not changed drastically. Getting through to any supervisor at RG&E is extremely difficult. And when you can get one on the phone, they blame the customer for not doing the meter readings. I reminded them today that I'm not actually an RG&E employee and that they need to do their meter readings themselves unless they're planning to add me to the payroll. They told me that their policy is to meet their reader once a year. Then perhaps they should bill me once a year. My friends in Fairport, which is a suburb down the road from Rochester, which has a public utility, pay about $60 a month to energize an entire home. How can RG&E justify gouging the entire city of Rochester? They're swimming in profits by massively overcharging us for energy. We have no alternatives available. Public utility is the only way forward. A couple of short ones. Hillary Goldstein says, our story is quite simple. Our bills have gone up threefold. We don't even know why. No one has any answers at RG&E. Christina Marie Fiordaliso says, I've been an RG&E budget customer on a budget plan for 15 to 20 years. My $97 a month budget plan has recently jumped to about $170 a month in August, then $300 in September and October, most recently $430 for December's bill. No recourse or no answers, just pay or else. I'm a single homeowner. There is no way I'm consuming this much in utilities to warrant this huge jump. One more at least, David Sell says, every month I take pictures of my gas and electric meters and email them in. I rarely read my indecipherable bill, but noticed that the reads on my bill for a couple of months were listed as estimated. I called, and after the usual very long wait time, told that when the guys who input readings from email get behind, they just throw in an estimated reading. I have noticed that as well for the past few months that the meter reading guy never comes anymore. I have had to call and make an appointment to get actual reads. And one of my calls, I was asked why they haven't been, and the customer service rep said there is no guarantee they will come or not. Probably leave it there, but I'm happy to read a few more if we have time.
Well, I'm so glad that Dr. Wunderlich went first because it gives me the opportunity to say ditto and save us a little time. In Maine, we had a very similar experience. And as you mentioned, and thank you so much for inviting me to this event, I was the House Chair of the Joint Standing Committee on Energy, Utilities, and Technology in the Maine legislature for 6 years up until last June. And so I was responsible for essentially overseeing the Public Utilities Commission here and all of the laws that pertain to our investor-owned utilities. Avangrid, aka Iberdrola, is the owner of Central Maine Power, our largest utility here in Maine. And we experienced very, very similar things to what Michelle just laid out and what they have experienced more recently to us in upstate New York. For Maine, the troubles really began in 2017 with the rollout of a new billing system. And hundreds of thousands of Mainers received erroneous bills. This was documented in a report that finally the PUC decided to look into, but it took many people, writing letters, a lot like Michelle just pointed out, banding together. There was a massive Facebook group that started up with thousands and thousands of people, letters to the editor. I had to go out of business. I was bankrupted by this crazy utility bill that was twice as high as I ever received. My family is showering at the local Y because we can't afford to use electricity in our home anymore. We're terrified of using electricity in our home. These were the kinds of stories. I'm a senior. I'm getting threatening disconnection notices. I need to use my machine to breathe. I've got medications in the fridge. What do I do? Maine, like upstate New York, is rural, is not wealthy. And so many people were really thrown into an incredible state of stress, and there was a lot of harm, I think, as a result of that. So during the winter of 2017, 2018, the summer of 2018, the fall, we were hearing these stories again and again and again. And the PUC finally did decide to look into it, found smoke, and then looked further and found fire. Meanwhile, CMP, again, this Avangrid company, was putting up press conferences saying there's nothing wrong here. We did an internal investigation. Everything is fine. These customers must be mistaken. They were taking out full page ads in the largest paper in the state, saying that everything was fine. Long story short, the Public Utilities Commission did find that they had completely botched the rollout of their new billing system. They didn't code the system properly. They were cutting corners. They were looking to maximize profits by reducing staff time on this transition, reducing the time to implement, the time to test the transition. And so wouldn't you know it, this complex new billing system, which wasn't the computer's fault, it was the management's fault, was absolutely atrocious. And never before has a fine been issued by our Public Utilities Commission to the extent that it was. Honestly, it was a kind of a slap on the wrist, like price of doing business. It was $10.5 million. And what our PUC said to us on my committee was, well, that's the lowest that we can go. We need to give them a return on equity for all of their equity investments. We need to give them at least 8.25%. So that's the lowest we're comfortable going. And I said, you got to be kidding me. 8.25%, basically guaranteed profit on all of their equity investments is their punishment for this, for putting thousands and thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of Mainers through all this stress. That's their punishment. And they said, yeah, there's this thing called Hope and Bluefield. There are these, Supreme Court decisions from 80 years ago. And, we just don't feel comfortable going any lower than that because frankly, it's the lowest return on equity that's being allowed by any PUC in the country. So basically the PUC threw up their hands and said, that's the best we can do. And, and they also tried to make it seem like they were really taking action. In some ways they were, but, it was a really massive awakening for a lot of us about, just who wins and who loses in this. 8.25% guaranteed rate of return. Think about that. If you have a savings account right now at your local bank, chances are on average, you're making 0.1% interest, 0.1%, and they get 8.25% as a punishment. So talk to me about how that makes sense. Scottish Power, we should have known that this was coming, by the way, because Scottish Power had the same problem. Iberdrola also owns Scottish Power in Scotland. They're the largest utility there. They own many other companies around the world. They are the second largest electricity company in the world, second only to Nextera. And they own in Brazil, they own in Mexico, they're massive. So Maine is less than 2% of their holdings. I'm not sure their stakeholders or shareholders rather could put us, could find us on a map if we asked them to. But here we are, hey, care about us. So anyway, Scottish Power had very similar problems, and there are incredible, heartbreaking stories from Scotland in 2014, 2015, and then there was a penalty. And then again, recently, there have been another rash of problems, which I encourage you to look up and look into. It is just heartbreaking what's going on in Scotland. And there is, not surprisingly, a very significant movement in Scotland and the UK to take back control of their power as well. So I'm looking forward to this conversation tonight. Thank you for having me, Marielle, Lila, everyone else, and let's keep going.
Thank you, Seth and Michelle, for sharing those really hard-hitting stories. And you touched on it a bit, but I want to dig a little bit more into rates. So Iberdrola and Avangrid subsidiary in Connecticut recently raised rates 106%. And as you mentioned, Michelle, their subsidiaries in New York are seeking rate increases too. Can we expect similar rate increases if they come to New Mexico? Go ahead, Seth.
Yeah, absolutely. There will be rate increases, and the reason that I'm convinced of that is Avangrid is incredibly well resourced for rate cases. They're very, very, very good at lawyering up, and they will bring the kind of firepower to this new commission that you have, which is now sadly appointed and not elected. They will bring the kind of firepower to that conversation, to those rate cases that PNM never could have. And you know what? They'll make sure that most of those lawyers attorney's fees are paid for out of your rates. That's perhaps the most hurtful part of it, from my point of view. So, they might say at first that they'll keep rates low. Maybe there'll be an initial period where they say as part of a stipulation that they're going to keep rates down. That happened recently to us in another utility buyout. But right now in Maine, that company and CMP also are asking for another 30% rate increase. There's a proceeding right now at the PUC where they probably won't get quite that much, but 30% is a lot, right? It's a lot more than the rate of inflation. And in the last 10 years, we've seen our delivery rates double. I should say, by the way, our utilities here are just pole and wire utilities. We separated, we're restructured, so we separated generation. And Central Maine Power, aka Avangrid, aka Iberdrola, does not own generation, but they own the monopoly system of poles and wires, and that is the lifeline to our livable planet, right? That's how we electrify. That's how we decarbonize. The monopoly system of poles and wires is the only way that we get to save our planet and our children's future. So it is worth thinking about that philosophically as well. But will your rates go up? Absolutely, they will. And you probably didn't hear it here first.
Exactly.
Thanks, Michelle.
Yeah, so just to follow up on Seth, basically their whole business model is to shift as many costs onto the consumers as possible, do as little in return, and that's how they're structurally designed. So that's what you can expect, and particularly in a transition to renewable energy, that particular model is not going to be a helpful one for consumers, to not have the interests of the community aligned with service delivery. And so I already said that they're planning, they propose rate hikes basically every 2 to 3 years here. Currently the proposal is 20%. NYSEG, there's a 30% rate increase proposal for electric. They want to raise their rate of profit. I thought it would be interesting just to read, maybe following up on Joe's points at the beginning of really their lack of transparency and planning in the rate hikes, at least here. So a panel of state agencies responsible for determining if RG&E's capital expenditures are well-founded, necessary, and a good use of ratepayer money had the following things to say about their proposals in the current rate case and also previous rate cases. The panel found it to be difficult to find consistent and detailed information in its review of their proposals, and that they provide vague and inconsistent answers or fail to provide necessary documentation. That they had inconsistent responses led the panel to believe that RG&E does not have a clear picture on what they are planning to invest on for resiliency projects. That they're being irresponsible with how they prioritize investments, looking to invest money into circuits that will cost tens of millions of dollars, rather than trimming the trees on these circuits to provide reliability performance. Failed to provide a risk assessment, basically asked to have details on how they determine the cost of the projects, and received only vague responses and said there was no way to determine the cost basically, or an estimate. So there's more of this, in fact, but basically the point is, even when they are trying to, at least in New York, increase their rates, they have really no idea what their actual budget is, and they don't really do founded planning for that.
Thanks, Seth and Michelle, for sharing this really sobering information. Joe, we'll go back to you with a question about why Iberdrola and Avangrid want to come to New Mexico. How will it affect the state?
Thanks for that question, Leila. I'm not going to personally opine on this, but what I'll do is I'll mention maybe just a few pieces of information from the actual case. On the second day of the hearing in the merger case, a representative of Avangrid, Mr. Haverly, was asked by the hearing examiner, Ashley Schonauer, But what is it about acquiring PNM resources in PNM that is important to you in terms of your ability to do other things in the Southwest? And so the basic response, well, I'll quote, this is a quote from Mr. Haverly. We find that, if you would, a potential beachhead for further growth in the region as we move forward. And in subsequent questioning of Mr. Haverly, he basically was saying that the Northeast isn't growing as much as the Southwest, and they see New Mexico as kind of a base for future growth throughout the Southwest. Now, as I mentioned at the outset of my comments, part of I think the credibility issues that arose with Avangrid was the lack of compliance related to 2 wind farms in New Mexico. The first one was La Jolla Wind Farm, and basically, in testimony by our utility division director, Mr. Reynolds, he said that they did not make compliance filings concerning either construction permits that were required within 2 weeks, nor any notices that the La Jolla Wind Farm or the Gentai facilities were being placed into service. So that's a 304 megawatt wind farm, and that is the La Jolla Wind Farm. The other one is the El Cabo wind project. And at the time, the utilities division director testified, and this is in the certificate of stipulation, pages 159 and 160. He testified that Avangrid Renewables LLC deliberately skirted the Public Utility Act's location control and right-of-way width determination requirements for the El Cabo wind project. And so I would think that the hearing examiner, I think, was kind of startled that in these projects that are already, on the ground, that there was a lack of compliance on the part of Avangrid. Now, in terms of their interest in producing more renewables and to achieve their goal of greater growth in the entire Southwest with New Mexico as a base. Our experience during my tenure on the Public Regulation Commission was that it's the purchase power agreements. We were signing PPAs that represented some of the lowest cost renewable energy in the country, but these were pre-pandemic prices. Now, what we saw was PPAs post-pandemic had gone up about 25 to 30%. And so I think the issue could be, can an investor-owned utility's ability to self-build compete with purchase power agreements from renewable energy developers? I think that is a big question. And, how will this affect the renewable energy developers, in the state that also want to build renewable energy at the lowest possible prices to benefit ratepayers? And so here you have an intent, and you have a glimpse of what the presence could be in the form of these 2 wind projects that I believe are both in operations. And I might say that one of those, the El Cabo wind farm, was rated at 298 megawatts, and that is 2 megawatts under the threshold of 300 megawatts that requires location control by the Public Regulation Commission. And I think that was intentional, and that's unfortunate. And I think that maybe it calls into question the intent to skirt, these public regulation laws. And so I'll let others chime in on this, but I think those 2 bits of information, I think the intent of locating in New Mexico and the glimpse of what perhaps we can expect in terms of additional renewable energy projects by Avangrid Renewables LLC.
Thank you, Joe. Building on that, I want to go further into the renewables transition side of things. So Iberdrola, Avangrid, and their subsidiaries tout themselves as green companies that are environmentally friendly, yet they've spent a lot of time and money advocating against climate policy and funding front groups and misinformation against climate action. What has been your experience with this, Seth and Michelle? And are they moving your states quickly enough towards 100% renewable energy?
Michelle, you want me to kick this one off? Or do you want to?
Either way, I can. Yeah,
Go ahead.
so basically no, is the short answer. So for some context, New York State passed a very comprehensive climate law in 2019, which had large goals for 70% renewable electricity by 2030 and 80% economy-wide reduction in greenhouse gases by 2050. And basically, again, from rate case documents, it's clear to see that the companies have no comprehensive plans to comply with this plan that was passed 3 years ago. And they have also yet to conduct a full greenhouse gas inventory of their actual emissions. They are not meeting targets for efficiency or heat pump programs, or the requirements for the proportion of funds that go to low and moderate income customers, which are supposed to be 20%, and they're 6%. They're 4% in NYSEG. They're trying to advance false solutions with hydrogen blending projects. They also have planned, we have requirements in the climate law for 40% of climate funds to go to disadvantaged communities, and they have failed to plan for or even measure impacts on disadvantaged communities or carbon-related impacts needed for the impacts in the climate law. Additionally, they are still calling for investments in natural gas infrastructure, which of course continue to use our money to build new gas infrastructure that they know under this climate law will need to be decommissioned within 10 to 15 years. So basically they get the profits once they get to build those, and we're stranded with the costs. When it comes to lobbying and accelerating climate change, investor-owned utilities, as you mentioned, and especially Avangrid, are notorious for using ratepayer money to fund lobbies to expand their gas infrastructure and avoid the transition to consumer-owned renewables. So Avangrid is the largest energy sector donor to the New York State governor, who recently attempted to gut the 2009 climate law in favor of gas companies. So they contributed $160,000 to her through their PAC, and individual executives also had additional donations, and they are members and large funders of the Fossil Fuel Disinformation Front Group, New Yorkers for Affordable Energy, that has been trying to basically dismantle the climate law. They're also on the federal level one of Mitch McConnell's biggest election contributions to stop federal action on climate change. So pass it over to you, Seth.
Yeah, super familiar. So I actually started in the legislature in 2006, and I came in as a new state legislator asking to serve on the committee that oversees our utilities, because I did understand then that we needed our utilities to be partners in the transition, that those lines are the lifeline to a livable planet. We have to electrify, we have to drive EVs and have heat pumps and power it all with renewables, right? So I was really hoping that we would find in our utilities a partner in that transition, and a partner that was willing to share in the benefits of the transition and encourage, distributed renewables, for example, rooftop solar, right? Encourage efficiency, which, after all, efficiency or not using power is the cheapest and cleanest form of power. But what I found instead was a utility, Central Maine Power, again, owned by Avangrid, even then, that was diametrically opposed to those kinds of policies, that only wanted to go green if it meant more green money for them, and was the leading opponent to rooftop solar, was the leading opponent to efficiency. I thought I would see big oil as the problem. I thought they would send lobbyists and they'd be the problem. They were nowhere to be seen because they were out doing their deregulated thing. But these lobbyists knew, and they're, the folks that hired them knew, that because it's a monopoly and they have these sort of guaranteed profits, essentially, no competition at all. They don't need to run the business better. They just need to lobby more and control more of the playing board and maximize their profits that way. So we saw a lot of self-dealing, and instead of rooftop solar, instead of distributed renewables, distributed efficiency, they focused on projects that they would get to own. And a massive project was a transmission build out in this region. Other utilities in the Northeast were also building out at that time, around 2013, including Avangrid utilities. That sent our transmission rates, high voltage transmission component of our bill, it sent our transmission rates up 800% within the span of a decade. So that's all profit. There was a massive profit. I talked about 8.25% for them on the low end. For those high voltage transmission buildouts, which it turned out we didn't need, but they were building it and justifying it by opposing rooftop solar and efficiency. They got 13.99%, including the adders that FERC allowed. So they saw this incredible opportunity, and by golly, they weren't going to let anything stand in the way of it. And no, they were not going to share in the benefits of this transition. They were going to make darn sure they had it all to themselves. Similarly, they were developing another project, and it became very contentious here to bring power from Hydro-Quebec in Canada down to the Northeast. And that involved bulldozing a very significant strip of the northern forest, the largest contiguous tract of forest in this side of the Mississippi. And it meant cutting a swath through it that was as wide as the New Jersey Turnpike, and running a big new transmission line down through there. And some people said, well, we got to do this, and I understand the value of transmission, and we do need to connect regions. But there was another line that CMP wasn't telling us about here in Maine while they were spending on ads for this project. There's another line that would have undergrounded the power through Vermont and come under Lake Champlain and under existing roadways, very responsible, put forward by a competitor, and they didn't want to talk about that. So we said, well, okay, let's at least let's have a study done of whether this will have a net greenhouse gas benefit or not. Let's have an independent study done. And they lobbied so hard against that bill, spending tens of thousands of dollars on lobbyists, because they didn't want us to know what the actual global greenhouse gas impact of that project would be. So they were saying it was green, and it was in fact greenwashing their project. Long story short, that project was shot down by 60% of Mainers in a 60-40 vote by the people of Maine, after CMP and their partners in Quebec spent far more, I think 3 times as much as the opposition. And rather than accepting the will of the people and accepting the landslide result of that election, they decided to take it to court, and they are now suing the people of Maine. In fact, the case is being argued this week. Again, it's bounced back and forth between the courts over that particular bulldozing of the forest. So as long as it's the green of money, Central Maine Power and Avangrid and Iberdrola are very happy to go green, but they will only greenwash their projects for that purpose. And we have no other company. One other thing I want to say about this is there's no other company that lobbies to this extent here in Maine, or that astroturfs to this extent here in Maine. For the past several years, they have been spending over $1 million a month on political ads. And just to put that in perspective, Maine only has 1.3 million people. So they're basically spending $1 per Mainer per month on ads, and doing it for several years on political ads. And there's also the lobbyists, there's also the lawyers at the Public Utilities Commission and the experts, many of whom are paid for by our rates. Again, the only green that Iberdrola and Avangrid care about is the color of your money.
Thank you, Seth and Michelle. We're going to do one more question with our panelists and then go to the audience questions. So Marielle, can you please explain to us what the current legal situation is and what might happen if this case goes back to the governor-appointed PRC? Oh, you're muted, Marielle.
Thank you. I'm even blown away by Seth and Michelle's stories, and this is where I spend most of my energy every single day. So we won in front of the Public Regulation Commission. We won, as Joe said, in front of the hearing examiner with a comprehensive, methodical, 455-page scathing opinion recommending the rejection of the merger as not being in the public interest, and that the risks and the harms outweigh the benefits. And that basically he found that not having reliable electricity and not having customer service was way more important than having dollars and few dollars, really, relatively. And then the commission unanimously upheld his recommended decision. And so they have a right, as they did, to appeal to the Supreme Court. It's a direct appeal to the New Mexico Supreme Court. And so they, meaning PNM and Avangrid, appealed. And essentially, what they argued was, hey, we know that the administrative agency, in this case, the PRC, is allowed to rely on hearsay, which is an out-of-court statement to prove the truth of the matter asserted, but they relied on hearsay too much. And here's 5 examples, okay? That is the entire appeal. They relied, the PRC and the hearing examiner relied on 5 examples of hearsay, and we think that that prejudiced the PRC such that that's why they denied the merger. New Energy Economy, and at the time, the PRC defended the decision. And we both said in different separate briefs that, hey, I mean, in particular, New Energy Economy, I'll just speak for New Energy Economy, took the position that, yeah, there were those 5 pieces. They were right to rely on those 5 pieces. Here's why. But even if you threw out all of those 5 pieces, there's a mountain of evidence against Avangrid Iberdrola. And when you go to, a new job, or, your landlord to get a new apartment, they say, where have you rented before? Where have you worked before? And you look at the history of performance. And that's precisely what the hearing examiner rightfully did. And what he found, as you've heard, is that there was $65 million worth of fines and violations just in the prior 5 years, that there was a history of outages and unreliability, that there was a history of failing to deliver on solar, which is exactly where we need to go. Actually, Avangrid and Iberdrola have less solar in their portfolio than PNM does. And he was like, well, why go backward? Anyway, so we've done the briefing. It's in front of the Supreme Court. And then the PRC changed. And the prior PRC, which Joe sat on, filed a brief saying, we were right, this was a factual determination, and we stand by our decision. And so then the new PRC came, and in 5 closed-door sessions, they determined to make a motion with PNM and Avangrid to withdraw their appeal and require it to go back down to the PRC under this hyper narrow rule that doesn't apply. The rule that they cited was a rule for reconsideration of a order or decision that must be made within 10 days. Well, all of you know out there that this has been going on for a year and a half. So that rule can't apply. But why did they ask for that rule? That rule would not allow due process considerations. So the normal, regular, you watch TV, you hear the law, and what you do is, you know, the proponent, so in this case, Avangrid and PNM makes a proposition, they want to merge, they have the burden of proof, they have to have testimony, and we get to ask them questions, and we get to ask, you know, in discovery, but also in cross-examination, and then we have our own witnesses, and then we go through a hearing, which in this case was almost a 2-week hearing. And just so you know, there was 40,000 pages of evidence put forth in our hearing, and a lot of it was evidence that was put forth by New Energy Economy that the hearing examiner really methodically went through and then discussed in his decision. And so the normal, and this is what's really important, everybody, the normal procedure is you go through an appeal. If you lose, it's over. If you win, it goes back to the PRC, and we see for what reason the PRC lost. But this is now a pattern of misconduct, which is that Avangrid, Iberdrola, they don't play by the rules. They say, oh no, we want to dismiss our appeal, and we want you to act Supreme Court and order Supreme Court as if we won. Well, if they want that, then we should go through the rest of the appeal and let's see if they do win. But they want an expedited procedure that discounts due process. And I will say that even the other signatories to the merger, 100% of the people say, if this comes back, and I need you all who are on this webinar to demand that due process rights, our due process rights, are heard. And the reason they don't want that to be heard is because they don't want Dr. Wunderlich or Seth Berry, Representative Seth Berry, to come before the commission and tell them what they know about what Avangrid's abuses are in their state. And the last thing I'll just say is we don't know when the Supreme Court is going to decide. They asked for an expedited decision-making without any basis. They literally said nothing. They just said, oh, it would be in the public interest for you to expedite this decision. Well, the Supreme Court has not acted in that way yet. And so it could be a decision tomorrow by the Supreme Court, or it could be in a month or longer. Or somewhere in between. So we don't know exactly when that's going to happen. But of course, if you sign up to newenergyeconomy.org, you will be the first one to know.
Thank you, Mariel, for explaining a pretty confusing process to us. We're going to go to some audience questions now. And we'll start out with an anonymous question asking, besides the obvious national security concerns about a foreign-owned corporation, is there not another risk of keeping the lights on for a fair ratepayer price due to the high debt and equity and financial overextendedness of Iberdrola? Go ahead, Seth.
Yeah, I feel like it's a two-part question. You know, the debt to equity ratio is part of what ratepayers typically do pay for. Some taxable debt, maybe at 5%, some equity at 10%. And that's how our rates are designed, right, by most commissions around the US. And it has to do with that crazy rigged system that I mentioned earlier. I think that is a risk because it's expensive. If we had truly public utilities in this country, across this country, we could finance our future at half the cost, literally half the cost. because you borrow, it's all debt, there's no equity, and you borrow at tax exempt rates from revenue bond banks, who there's a $5 trillion revenue bond market, I think, right now. You know, they love to lend to utilities because they have very predictable revenue streams, right? You know, we all pay our electric bill, right? So they know that they will get paid, the banks know that they will get paid back. So they're happy to finance it at literally half the cost that we would otherwise pay with these investor-owned utilities. Even a good investor-owned utility is going to cost us twice as much as a good, you know, truly public utility. So, you know, I think that's sort of point one on debt to equity. But you mentioned Qatar in the question, and I do have to point out that BlackRock and Qatar, the two biggest owners of Iberdrola, are not great organizations. You know, we're literally talking about the government of Qatar. This is a government-owned, it's oil wealth, and this government sovereign wealth fund, which is the largest single owner of Iberdrola and Avangrid. They also own direct shares in Avangrid. It's about 10.5% if you include both. This is a country that, you know, admitted to the crime of bribing officials with FIFA in order to get the World Cup, that killed thousands of migrant workers, you know, working in the desert heat to build those stadiums, that, you know, makes it a capital crime to be LGBTQ, right? That, and that recently was found guilty of bribing people, bribing European Union officials. So not a great, you know, I mean, not a great owner, certainly. And they do control a significant portion of Avangrid's money and shares. And BlackRock, I will just say, is the world's, it's been called the world's largest shadow bank, and I'll leave it at that.
Thank you, Seth. We'll go to another question on who is behind the New Mexico Constitutional Amendment 1 appointed Public Regulation Commission amendment in 2020, and why is the governor for the merger?
Since Joe is not on, I guess I'll take it. I want to say one thing that you should all know, because I feel like I have to just say it before the end of the webinar. In terms of, are our rates going to go up, and how do we know? The CEO of Avangrid has said we are going to have capital expenditure investments of $14.6 billion between now and 2025. $4 billion of that is projected to come from PNM. So just if you want to know if our rates are going to go up, that's the plan. That is their plan. So we should believe them. And that leads me into why does Michelle care about this so much? You know that probably many of you know that she is fiercely behind hydrogen. Avangrid wants to bring hydrogen here. You heard Michelle talk about hydrogen blending, which, by the way, New Energy Economy opposed with the New Mexico Gas Company and won and got them to retract their proposal for a hydrogen blending last year. And but this is what where they want to go. They are invested in mostly in nuclear and gas, and then wind. And so this is not where we want to go. We want to go towards 100% renewable energy, and we want it to be publicly owned. And that is not conducive to the political aspirations of many political leaders. You know, they have spent, just in 2022, Avangrid Iberdrola has spent 10 times the amount of political contributions, and that's the above board ones. That's not the dark money ones. It's the above board ones in 2022 that they did the year before in 2021. So this is where they're moving towards. And I just want you to know, maybe some of you have seen that Iberdrola and Avangrid are selling their assets in other places in the world. 77% of their Mexico assets they just sold after the Mexican government gave them a fine of $466 million for market manipulation and refusing to abide by the regulatory agency's permits. And so why are they shifting the money from places like Spain and Mexico? It's because they want to come to the United States. You've heard that in New York, they've raised rates 20% after 20% after 20%, at least that's what they're asking for. In New Mexico, I just want you to know, even PNM doesn't ask for that right now. Like, we're hoping to kick their ass in this rate case that's pending right now, and they're asking for 9.5%. And we want to get it below 4%, the rate increase. So, and we haven't had a rate increase case for 6 years. But if Avangrid comes here and they've already told us that they're going to increase rates by, or that their new capital expenditure targets are $4 billion, you bet that equates to rate increases. And so why these politicians want them, it's because they get, I don't know, gaga with the idea of money and jobs, and and they don't look into things like what Michelle said, which is that they contract them out and they use non-union labor and they do other kinds of shady accounting for job production. What they do is, unfortunately, they grease the wheels through political contributions. I didn't answer the whole, anything to do with the PRC. That's like could be a whole webinar in and of itself. But the fact of the matter is that PNM and the governor and NRDC and Environmental Defense Fund work together, and in what I could only say is what I believe is neoliberal politics, like the elite know best, we'll handle this energy situation, don't worry your pretty little head off, well, we've got it taken care of. And and they did an undemocratic thing, which is take away the people's right to vote, and especially indigenous people's right to vote, because they had a seat at the table and now they do not. And now we have 2 white men and a Hispanic man who, and only two people are left out of the 3 who are supposed to be deciding this new merger. It's a travesty of justice.
All right, we'll go to another audience question. This one from Laura. I understand that there's a difference of opinion about this merger, and some environmental groups support it. Please give a short explanation of this division. Marielle, you were touching on those differences a little bit. And then kind of a second part of the question, if the merger is defeated, what's the roadmap for getting to public power?
There's more and more groups that are joining every day the resistance to the Avangrid merger, and in part because of some of the things that we've learned from Seth and Michelle, right? Which is, well, they're not as environmentally friendly as they say. There's been no evidence, zero, that PNM is unable to borrow money on Wall Street. I've been doing this work for 18 years, and there's no evidence that any time at all that they haven't been able to borrow from Wall Street. So the idea that, oh, Avangrid has so much more money and we need money to invest in the grid or whatever these things are that they're saying, it's just a false narrative, and it's because people don't know. So I think that we need people to listen to Michelle and Seth. That's what I think we need people. I think what we need to do is everybody on this call needs to take the recording and send it to 5 or 10 friends and let them hear. This isn't from us. This is from our friends that we've made across the country who have their real experiences with failing to meet climate goals, failing to care about, low income folks, rate gouging, unreliability, failing to have proper customer service, on and on and on. This is not okay. And there is no evidence that Avangrid is going to get us there, or Iberdrola is going to get us there. As a matter of fact, there's evidence to the contrary, that they have invested, Brown University came up with this report that said that they're their number one barrier to climate legislation. That's not us, that's a Brown University study that said it. So I think that we have to educate our friends to explain that we don't, I just want to say that, like, at first when I saw Avangrid's 3-leaf logo, I was like, oh my God, we're going to have somebody else come in instead of PNM. And now I'm like, I'd rather deal with PNM, but I'd really rather have public power. And I'd rather have public power. And I will say very little because I want to turn it over to our friends who've been working on public power and are as well. When you learn of these things, and when you learn and you listen to what Seth says, which is, we can do it, we have to invest in our people. It means that it's about belonging, and it means it's about rigor, and it means about community control, and it means a whole bunch of things like taking care of our community, and being responsible in that way and being held accountable. We don't hold PNM accountable, and we sure as hell are not going to hold Iberdrola, Avangrid accountable, because they make their decisions in Spain and they don't care what our regulatory agency does. And even if they get caught, okay, they pay a fine. That's not going to happen if it's done in Santa Fe County. And, somebody said to me, like, oh, Santa Fe County can't even deal with its weed problem. How are they going to run solar and storage for Santa Fe? And I'm like, the weed problem is a lot tougher than solar and storage for Santa Fe, because I have solar on my house. Once it's on, I turned it on. We haven't done anything in years, and it works, and it's guaranteed for 25 years. What do you have? And some people say it's guaranteed it will last for 40 years. What do you have that's guaranteed for 25 years? You don't even have your marriage or your relationship that's guaranteed for 25 years, let alone anything else. I mean, it's amazing. And it doesn't take a rocket scientist to run a utility. It takes care and repair, and I think we can do it. Seth and Michelle, please take it on.
Amen. I'm really excited about the upswelling of support for public power, community-owned power around the country. I kind of started to take an interest in the topic in a really serious way 5 years ago, and began to frame up a bill that was presented to the legislature. And then, we had a feasibility study, and they said, yes, it's constitutional. Yes, it's legal. Yes, it'll save you money. So that was encouraging. And then we had another bill the next go around, the next legislative cycle, that actually got the support of the bipartisan support, I might add, of the whole House of Representatives and the whole Senate in Maine. And if it hadn't been for the governor vetoing it, we'd be there. and that's remarkable, because it's the first time that any state, I mean, if it were to happen, and we're going to vote on it. Fast forward, we collected signatures. It's on the ballot November 7th. So we will vote on this November 7th, and that's the people of Maine that will vote on it. And stay tuned, because we're being outspent dramatically. Iberdrola is fighting us, with everything they've got, and I think it's a toss-up, to be honest. I think that we have a lot of support, and we're growing support, and it's a very grassroots David and Goliath situation. But I have a lot of faith in the people of Maine. So November 7th, stay tuned. But that's just our situation, and around the country we're seeing this incredible interest in truly public utilities, community-owned utilities, as the lifeline to our future. In places like Rochester and places like Louisiana, DC, New York, East King County, Washington, right there in New Mexico, and PG&E considered it. And it's the right thing to do now. I think of Horace Mann, who was a leader, and one of many leaders, by the way, not the only one, but the leader in the movement to create public education, right, 150 years ago or so. And public education at the time was thought of as kind of a crazy idea. We're gonna do this for everyone and make it universal. And I think this is the kind of generational moment that creation of public education was. If we can take back our future, take back our monopoly grid system of poles and wires, which is truly delivering a critical public good, then we really will have done something profoundly important for our future. And it is about community building and democratic decision making, but it's also about the financing I mentioned earlier. So it's just been incredibly inspiring to see how many people are getting interested in it. And I should say Maine is building on the efforts of many people over the decades. I look back to Nebraska that actually did go to fully community-owned utilities back in the 1940s. So the lineage of this effort and the history of what we're talking about is not entirely new. It's just that the stakes are much higher because of climate change and because of the need to electrify. So I'll turn it over to Michelle with that.
Exactly, yes. And it's such a honor and a privilege to be connected with all of y'all fighting against Avangrid and expanding this vision in this fight. I would just really emphasize again that we are collectively paying for everything already. There is not, Avangrid is not putting their own money into this. They are putting all of their costs onto us, and we pay them all of the costs and a guaranteed rate of profit. So if we have public utilities, we don't have to pay that guaranteed rate of profit anymore. In Rochester, in this area, that's $100 million a year that we can reinvest in lowering rates, in actually choosing what to do with what we want to do with our money, that we can make those decisions rather than that being a completely intransparent black box thing where we don't know what's happening and we have no control. We can make those decisions ourselves. So, with public utilities, you have the power to make, rate-making decisions. You can have progressive rates that are, cheaper for low-income customers. You can do what Los Angeles just did and just stop shutoffs for low-income customers, have different shutoff policies. You can choose to say, okay, we actually do want a full-scale electrification and full efficiency program for all area homes, and this is our plan for it, and this is where our money's going. We can take the jobs that have been outsourced and say, no, we want jobs here, and we want actually functional customer service and a functional billing system, and have that local economic benefit where we can actually align our priorities and our desires with the communities. So in New York, at least, the process is pretty clear. It's an implementation study, a referendum, and then a buyout. Interestingly, with the buyout, basically it's a court process that determines the price. And sorry, I live next to a busy road. It's more or less like having a mortgage. We're not required to pay that price upfront. It doesn't go through taxes. It's spread out over time through the rates that we pay for ourselves. So again, it's really which system do we want? And we want a system that serves our interest or those of a multinational corporation. I'm sure there's next steps that you want to talk about for people to do here as well.
Yes, it's really inspiring to hear about what's happening in Maine and New York. Thank you for sharing those examples. We do want to get to next steps and what we can do. But first, I just want to ask a quick question for Joe. From the chat or from the Q&A, Lynn asked, did you all on the PRC find evidence during your examination of the proposed merger of falsehoods and or misrepresentations by Avangrid and or PNM? Not such a quick question, I know, but anything you want to highlight, Joe?
Well, I think, as I mentioned earlier, I think that was one of the main issues that came to light, not disclosing some of the performance issues and some of the sanctions that were levied against Avangrid subsidiaries on the East Coast, skirting, public regulation compliance laws in the development and construction and operation of 2 wind farms by Avangrid Renewables. One thing that I wanted to mention that no one saw was that there was a very unique appendix to the almost 500-page recommended decision, and that was a confidential, active Spanish investigation into some principals, executive officers with the parent company Iberdrola. I'm not going to go into any great detail. Some people think it's stale, but at that time, the contents of that confidential Spanish investigation were quite alarming. It was something out of a spy novel. I think I said that before. It's corporate espionage at the highest levels. And so I think that was a consideration. But in my line of questioning, I did participate in the hearings, and I questioned Mr. Kump, the president of Avangrid. I wanted to see more grid investment. The PNM grid is suffering from, key interconnection points that are already at capacity. Many others are near capacity, and there's no funding source. The legislature, in their wisdom, passed the Grid Modernization Act, and it included a grant program that would benefit tribal governments, local governments. It hasn't been capitalized, and I asked PNM, would you be willing to capitalize a grant program to help some of these local governments? I was very concerned about, exacting more benefits for ratepayers. It was in the middle of a pandemic, and at that time, PNM was already beginning to disconnect some of its ratepayers, despite a lot of pandemic aid. And also, I questioned them regarding their hardball tactics. I think Seth mentioned firepower in fighting public referendums, hiring private investigators, challenging petitions, hiring attorneys. It was just very troubling, and I wanted an assurance that those tactics wouldn't be employed here in New Mexico for any public referendums that may challenge their status quo. So those are kind of some of the issues that were on top of my list, and I agree with Mariel. Ashley Schanauer, our senior hearing examiner who's since retired. His work was stellar in this recommended decision. And I stand by my decision, and I applaud Ashley for the way he conducted himself and the conclusions that he made in his recommended decision. And let me just say one last thing. We have a Republican and some Democrats when we were in that elected commission, and it's rare that you see a unanimous vote, and this was a unanimous vote. And so partisan political ideology did not play a role. I think that the facts were very clear at that time as we saw them.
I just want to say, I remember when you asked, Joe, you asked Kump, who was the CEO of Avangrid, are you going to do those kinds of PACs and front groups here? Are you willing to say that you're not going to invest in dark money? And I remember his answer was, no, we're not willing to say that. We will use whatever tactics we need to use that are legal. That's what he said, remember, to get what we need to get done. That's what he said. That was his answer.
Yeah, and then his other answer on grid investment was that, we're just going to commit to historical investments in the grid, which I thought was, from my opinion, from my perspective, given the needs here in New Mexico, I thought that was woefully inadequate. Sorry, I've been coming in and out. I'm having some Zoom problems, so sorry about that.
No, thank you so much for being here, Joe, and all of our panelists. This has been such a great conversation. I want to wrap us up with a few of the questions from the chat or the Q&A that all have the same theme, which is what can we do to resist? What are the alternatives? Mariel and others, can you recap some action items for us?
Well, there is maybe one of my colleagues, okay, just put in here. There's a in the chat, if you copy and paste that into your own browser, you can sign up. We're actively opposing the merger, and it would be great if you would want to, one is, like I said, we're going to send this recording out to all of you, plus answer the questions that we didn't get to. We'd love for you to send that out to your friends and colleagues, and so to inform them. It's a big deal, you all. If this merger comes here, it will be here for decades, and we will be victimized like they have been in Maine and New York and Connecticut and Scotland. And the thing is it seems like it's a big lift to keep them out, but the bigger lift is if they came and then we had to try to kick them out. So we really need to keep them out now. The other thing is that if you sign up on that on the no merger document, then we'll be in touch with you in particular, and we need to grow this. So if you have a church group or a choir group or whatever, if you ask them to take a few minutes to think about this, and what does it mean to know that some people who really can't afford, whether that's seniors on fixed incomes or folks who are of low income, who could not afford this kind of company coming here. It's important as a social justice and climate justice move to take a strong stance. We need people to write letters to the editors, editor, to write op-eds. There's plenty of things for you to do, but the first and foremost is to share it with your friends and family and colleagues. So say that.
Thank you, Marielle. Professor Michelle, anything you want to add?
I just want to say thank you to New Energy Economy and Commissioner Maestas and others who have really led in standing up to this multinational monopoly corporation. They really are focused on controlling our energy future and maximizing their profits, from that effort. And as we've heard today, and I think we really only scratched the surface, this is not a corporation with a deep-seated set of ethical values. And they have a long history of abuse, and I think it's time that somebody stood up to them. And I'm just incredibly impressed that so far, at least, New Mexico has done so. But they will continue to try to do an end run, and we've seen that many times here as well. So keep the faith, keep up the good work, and know that there are a lot of people cheering for you from all around the country.
And I just want to say thank you all for having me on this distinguished panel. There's a lot to be thankful for in terms of looking forward here in New Mexico. Representative Patricia Roybal Caballero was another pioneer legislator here, championing community solar with a 30% carve out for disadvantaged communities. We incentivize these community solar projects to provide up to 50% set aside. And so those are things that that go to energy justice. And I think we have a lot more work to do, but I think we're really moving forward in many ways as a state. And so we just all need to stay vigilant. And this is not a spectator sport. We need to engage.
Exactly. I'll just echo what Seth and Joe just said, and know from our work here that, to go up against a multinational corporation, you need strong movements and you need everyone involved. So please do spread the word, and start building so you can have the vision that we're all fighting for collectively.
Thank you, Joe, Michelle, Seth, and Marielle. We'll be sending out the recording, follow-ups to the questions, and please go to that No Merger Now link and sign up to get involved. Thank you all for being here. Good night.
Night.
Bye.
Thanks, Layla.
Okay, thank you. Hope to talk